all my wonderful listeners, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, I bring you episode 77, which will explore the dynamic and complex world of chemical signaling within the animal's body. Chemical signals are ubiquitous throughout an animal's tissues, as they're involved in all manner of basic maintenance and day-to-day processes. Other chemical signals, like adrenaline, are only released in those rare moments where the animal is in immediate danger, or in the moments leading up to the successful capture of a prey animal. I'll talk about all of these and more in today's episode on animal chemical signaling. All of the organs and the glands in the body that produce and release these chemical signals are all part of the endocrine system. Many, but not all of the chemical signals themselves, are called hormones. A hormone is some particular species of signaling molecule that gets sent out into the bloodstream and has a strong signaling function that alters the performance of other tissues. This is an important distinction between other signaling methods like action potentials that carry signals down the length of an axon to other neurons. These neural signals have a relatively short half-life, and they affect a small number of adjacent cells. With hormones, the signal is literally the chemical itself, and its presence in the tissue carries the information, it carries the message. Information is relayed when the hormone chemical binds to a receptor on the targeted cells in the appropriate tissue, which then induces a specific response. Hormones and other chemical signals are exceedingly powerful relative to other biomolecules, because they can have long-lasting, wide-ranging effects that can cause macro-scale changes to an animal's morphology and physiology. For this reason, hormones and other signaling molecules are present in the body in relatively low concentrations. When they're released, only a little bit is actually released at any given time. The endocrine system itself is a decentralized system. Consider that the nervous system is generally all one coherent mass of nerves. Consider that the lungs and the heart are all centralized structures connected together through an unbroken circuit of blood vessels. The endocrine system is not really like this. There's a number of glands, and these are like large masses of cells more than they are actual organs, but most endocrine cells are just on their lonesome, scattered across a tissue or throughout an organ. The definition of a cell in the endocrine system is not clearly defined. Some cells can serve a predominantly endocrine function, but other cells have other primary functions, and in the course of performing those functions, they might peripherally perform endocrine functions by releasing various chemical signals. The endocrine system is therefore not really a centralized, specific structure, like you could point to with the cardiovascular or the nervous systems. I think that you could describe the endocrine system, therefore, as something closer to a biochemical software system that allows the hardware to communicate and coordinate its functions so that it works properly. The only large, coherent structures that you can point to in the endocrine system would be the glands that are centralized in the upper torso and the neck. But even then, they're pretty small, and there's a lot more of them that are even smaller scattered throughout the body. The endocrine system also overlaps somewhat with the neural system, as neurons are also a breed of chemical messengers, and they interact with and release hormones, just like many endocrine cells. Neurotransmitters, which I talked about in the previous episode on animal neurology, are chemical signals that are released across the synapse to send information from one neuron to another, and thus relay a signal. These neurotransmitters are chemical signals that are sent between neurons, and some of them fall under the umbrella of hormones, produced through an endocrine process that distributes them through the bloodstream. Although neural signals are only shared between neurons, the overlap between the neural and the endocrine system is made obvious when you shift your attention immediately outside the neural system. Neurons don't just send chemical signals to each other, they also produce neuroendocrine signals, also called neurohormones, which are chemicals that are produced by neurons and released into the bloodstream to have an effect on downstream cells in other organs and tissues throughout the body. Besides neuron-based signals, the other major types of signals in the endocrine system are autocrine, paracrine, and endocrine signals. These terms all refer to the physical range of effect that the signal has in the body, from its point of secretion. An autocrine signal is one that's meant for the same cell that secreted it. For example, interleukin-2 is the name of a hormone that's released by T cells of the immune system. I talked about them in detail in episode 75 on the animal immune system. Now, interleukin-2 is released by the T cell, and it diffuses across the T cell's outer membrane, and then it binds to receptors on the same T cell. It doesn't really go off the membrane, it doesn't go very far. This form of self-signaling with interleukin-2 can encourage two different responses in the T cell. It can keep encouraging the T cell to perform its immune functions, almost as if the cell is saying words of encouragement to itself, like, keep going, you got it, buddy, to keep focused on hunting down and killing the infected cells. And the other response is to encourage the T cell to replicate and make more T cells that can then further contribute to the greater immune response. Now, paracrine signals diffuse a little farther outward. Instead of spreading across the cell's outer surface like a glass of water that gets spilled across a table, the paracrine signals diffuse into the nearby matrix, and they can affect many cells that are in close proximity to the signal-releasing cell. Because of this proximity factor, paracrine signals are often used to relay a message throughout a specific tissue. Imagine a general sheet of cells comprising a generalized tissue. A hormone is released somewhere else in the body. It travels through the bloodstream a short distance, and one of these hormone molecules reaches this tissue. That signal molecule binds to a single receptor on a single cell, but it causes that cell to then release a paracrine signal. Now, even though only one cell got the original signal from the hormone, a group of nearby cells have just been made aware because of this paracrine signal, and they can then release more of their own paracrine signal to tell other cells nearby to them that are even further away from the original source cell. And this goes on as the information spreads across the tissue in these waves of paracrine signals. And all of the cells are eventually made aware of what's going on. They're made aware of the informational input that the tissue has received from the hormone. Additionally, specific tissues can only use or respond to very specific signaling molecules. And this is important. It's really evolutionarily useful. This is a way of regulating the hormone signal so that only the target tissues get the signal, and no other tissues or organs get a wonky false positive or anything that would mess them up and cause damage to the animal. The third type of signal is the endocrine signal, or the true endocrine signal, which is a chemical sent through the bloodstream to reach anywhere else in the body. The cells that produce these endocrine signals are often scattered across a tissue and embedded within a matrix of other cells that have other purposes. But some of these endocrine cells grow together in clumps or masses, and these are called endocrine glands. The glands are kind of like small organs, like organoids, whose sole purpose is to produce and then secrete a particular hormone into the bloodstream. I've already mentioned the adrenal glands, which are small pyramidal-shaped glands that sit above the kidneys, and they produce adrenaline, or epinephrine. Other endocrine glands include the thymus, the thyroid, and the male and female gonads. In contrast to the endocrine glands are the exocrine glands. These glands operate outside of the endocrine system entirely, because they don't secrete their chemical products into the bloodstream. Instead, exocrine glands secrete stuff onto the outside of the animal's body, or into the internal body cavities. And for that matter, the stuff that they secrete isn't even a chemical signal in the first place, so it's really different than the endocrine system in a lot of ways. Now, the first one that might come to mind are sweat glands. This sweat evaporates and takes heat with it, which cools the animal down. Exocrine glands can be serous, mucus, or sebaceous, depending on what kind of product that they secrete. Sebaceous glands secrete some kind of lipid, like the Bohmian glands in the eyes that secrete meibum. This oily, lipid-based secretion helps keep the water in our eyes' tear film from evaporating, and it helps produce an airtight seal when the eyelids are closed. Mucus glands, as you probably expected, secrete a viscous, fluid-like mucus which contains carbohydrate products or mixed carbohydrates like glycoproteins. The mucus that's secreted along your nasal and respiratory tract is meant to both lubricate the air passage and trap any errant objects from making it too far down, like dust that might cause irritation, or microbes that might cause infections. This is why, if you blow your nose after being around heavy machinery or being in a wood shop, your mucus will be really discolored. It's picked up all of the airborne particles and trapped them so that they don't make it down your throat and damage your lungs or get into your bloodstream. So when you blow your nose and get it out of your face, and you look at it, it's like a brown or a black chunk of goo. It's kind of gross, but it serves an important function. Lastly, the serous glands secrete a watery substance, which is usually rich in proteins. The sweat glands are serous glands, and the sweat that they produce is the salty water mixture that's meant to take heat away from the body. This classification of serous, mucus, and sebaceous glands is based on what the cell produces. Now, exocrine glands can also be organized a different way. They can also be organized according to how they secrete their products, and this is actually really interesting. So you have Merocrine glands that secrete chemicals through exocytosis. There's a vesicle containing the chemical that's floating within the cell, within the merocrine cell, and this vesicle will float to the apical surface of the cell. It'll merge with the membrane, and then it will release the chemical to the outside world. It's pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward, and it's safe. It's safe for the cell. Apocrine glands, on the other hand, have cells that will package their chemical product into the apical half of the cell, and then pinch it off. The membrane of this pinched off portion will eventually degrade, and this will release all of the chemical cargo. Now, the cell who releases this is still alive, but it's basically been pinched in half, and so it has to regrow that second half before it can fill it with more chemicals and then pinch it off again to release them. Lastly, there are Holocrine glands, which have holocrine cells that just fill themselves up with the chemical product, fill up their whole cellular body, and then they just explode. The holocrine cell commits a violent suicide, but this provides the force to release a giant blast of the chemical product into the surrounding matrix. The Bohmian gland that I mentioned earlier is one such holocrine gland. It secretes its oily lipid product by having its cells fill themselves with it and then undergo a suicidal bursting of their membrane, which basically allows it to flood over the tear layer and provide that protective sheeting. However, it's very important to understand that the exocrine system, with all of its cells, be they serous, sebaceous, holocrine, or whatever, all of these are not a part of the endocrine system. They don't produce hormones. They don't even produce chemical signals. They're not involved in any way in cell signaling or sending messages, aside from the fact that they only get the signal to tell them to release the chemical that they produce. They don't tell any other cells to do anything. Basically, they don't really do anything at all that endocrine glands do. And the only reason that I even brought them up here was because I was talking about glands, and there's only the endocrine and exocrine glands. And if I wasn't going to talk about them now during this episode, there's really no other episode that would quite fit in with bringing them up, so here you go. The only distinction that I want to make here is the pancreas. The pancreas is an organ that contains both endocrine and exocrine cells. The pancreas's exocrine cells will release digestive enzymes into the intestines, while its endocrine cells release insulin and glucagon into the bloodstream. Okay, so coming back around to the endocrine system, I should go over the three types of hormones. Polypeptides, or proteins. They can be chemical derivatives of amino acids, or they can be a type of lipid called a steroid. Peptide hormones and amino acid derivative hormones will bind to receptors on the outer surface of a target cell's membrane. Steroid hormones, however, being lipids, are lipid-soluble, and they can move through the plasma membrane of the target cell to bind to receptors that are inside of it, inside the target cell. Now, this isn't an absolute rule, as there are steroids that do bind to receptors on the outside of the cell from time to time, and there are other exceptions. The thyroid gland, for example, produces the hormones triiodothyronine and thyroxine, which are both derivatives of the amino acid tyrosine. but they're both a kind of rare amino acid derivative that's actually lipid soluble and can move across the cell's membrane. From an evolutionary and physiological perspective, the purpose of hormones, as a class of biomolecules, is to coordinate the chemical processes going on in different tissues across the animal's body. Keep in mind that the body is a chemical superstructure, with hundreds and thousands of concurrent reactions and regulatory responses always ongoing to keep this superstructure alive. The hormones make sure that this superstructure is fully integrated and coordinated, so that the macro-scale effect of all of these micro-processes occurring throughout the body can occur in sync, and they can work together properly. As a class of biomolecules, hormones coordinate the development, growth, and reproduction of cells. They facilitate the cellular responses to environmental stressors, and they help the body communicate with itself so as to maintain internal homeostasis. As an example of hormones affecting growth and development, consider metamorphosis in amphibians, like frogs. At some point in the early development of the frog, its tadpole brain will send a signal to its pituitary gland, which will then secrete a hormone called thyroid-stimulating hormone. This stimulates the thyroid gland, and so in all of these little tadpoles, they'll have their thyroid gland produce and release the hormone thyroxine, which is also called T4. This thyroxine, or T4, enters the bloodstream, where it then flows to the target tissues and gets converted into triiodothyronine, or T3. You should recall that these were the lipid-soluble amino acid derivatives that I mentioned a moment ago. The T3 will move through the plasma membrane of the tadpole's cells, and it will bind to receptors on the nuclear envelope, which is the double plasma membrane of the nucleus, which encloses the DNA. The T3 hormone will bind to these nuclear receptors and cause them to alter DNA expression in the tadpole's body. This causes the tadpole to grow legs and lose its tail, and ultimately develop the mature body plan that allows it to hop around outside the water. Now you also have insects, where there are two hormones that play off one another to regulate this arthropod metamorphosis. As the insect larva grows, its body gets bigger. In order to get bigger, the larva has to undergo a series of molting events, where it sheds its exoskeleton and produces a new, larger one. During this early period in the insect's life, its tissues are rich in a chemical called juvenile hormone, or JH. And during a molting phase, there's a temporary surge of another hormone, called ecdysone. After a specific number of juvenile moltings, which has allowed the larva to grow to a certain size, the concentration of juvenile hormone in the tissues will drop. It'll go away almost entirely. The next time there's this rhythmic surge of the ecdysone hormone, it will not be regulated by juvenile hormone, because there is no juvenile hormone. It's at a really, really low concentration, and it can't counterbalance this sudden surge in ecdysone. When the ecdysone hormone has near total influence over the insect's body during this molting process, the molting process ends up going radically differently. Instead of molting normally by shedding an exoskeleton and producing a new one, the insect will produce a much harder external structure called a pupa case, or a cocoon. The ecdysone is inducing a total chemical renovation of the insect's body, rapidly maturing it into the adult form. This radical process of insectoid metamorphosis is why insect larvae look so radically different from insect adults. A ladybug, for example, has a round, bright red carapace that's dotted with spots of black. But as a larva, the ladybug has a highly segmented, horn-shaped body that's lined with ridges and bumps. An adult butterfly has large, beautiful wings with some kind of brightly colored or high-contrast pattern on them, whereas the butterfly as a larva is just some kind of wingless caterpillar. In vertebrate animals, hormones are integral to puberty, or other analogous phases of sexual maturation. Sex hormones are released by the gonads, be they ovaries or testes, which influences everything from physical development to behavior throughout the animal's life. In late adolescence, a vertebrate animal will typically undergo a period of sexual maturation. In humans, this period is called puberty, where the release of sex hormones is ramped up, and the body changes to accommodate the newfound fertility. In humans, primary sex determination begins at conception, with the presence of either XY or XX sex chromosomes. The sex determination of the child comes from the sperm, because the sperm brings one of the father's sex chromosomes into the egg, and the father has one X and one Y chromosome. And if the X chromosome is brought in, then the offspring will be female. If a Y chromosome is brought in, then the offspring will be male. Now, these chromosomes contain genes that induce the gonads to turn into ovaries or testes, and depending on which direction the gonads go, they release specific hormones that reinforce that developmental trajectory. This release of sex hormones ramps up during puberty, which leads to a growth spurt and the development of secondary sexual characteristics. In females, the ovaries release a steroid hormone called estradiol, which is a type of estrogen molecule. During puberty, estradiol is present in high concentration in the body, and among other things, it stimulates the enlargement of the breasts and the beginning of menstruation. In males, the testes release a steroid hormone called testosterone. Now, there are two stages of growth in the male's life where testosterone is present in high concentration in his tissues, relatively high concentration, higher than the baseline. This first time is during gestation, when the male is a fetus developing in the womb. The testosterone induces the body to begin growth of the male reproductive system, such as the physical structure of the penis, the scrotum, and the prostate. Another hormone is at work during this time too. It's a polypeptide hormone called the Mullerian inhibitory substance, and it inhibits the growth of the female sex organs, like the vulva, vagina, and the uterus. Now, this is actually really cool, because the human body appears to default during its gestational development, and it requires interfering chemical processes to stop the growth of the vagina and uterus, to put that on halt, and push the tissue to instead form a functional penis and testicles. Later in life, during puberty, the male will experience a second testosterone flush, which causes the penis and the testicles to enlarge, and it induces the growth of body hair on the face, chest, armpits, and the genitals. Puberty for females also includes the emergence of body hair, and both males and females experience a growth spurt. Now, throughout childhood and adolescence, the body is producing and releasing growth hormone because the child is growing relatively quickly compared to the growth rate for the entirety of the rest of its life. But when the body reaches puberty and these sex hormones are released at relatively very high concentrations, there's all these cool interactions between the sex hormones and the growth hormone, and it actually makes the growth hormone way more effective. And so that's why during puberty, when these sex hormones flush through the body, you also have this corresponding spurt in growth, because the growth hormone is suddenly supercharged. Both growth hormone and the sex hormones are released after puberty, and they're released for the rest of the animal's life. In males, they encourage the production of sperm, and in females, they regulate the menstrual cycle. The actual growth of the animal's physical size will eventually stop, but growth hormone is continually released throughout the rest of the animal's life, because it has so many functions besides just basic body growth. The body also stops growing because the epiphyseal plates on the ends of the bones will get ossified, and at this point, they can't grow anymore at all. So it's kind of like the body is flipping a switch and turning body growth off and going into a stage of just pure maintenance for the rest of the animal's life. In many vertebrate animals, the release of sex hormones is regulated by the photoperiod, or the length of the day, which corresponds to the season. Generally, the increasing photoperiod of the spring season will cause many animals to begin releasing sex hormones, and their breeding season will come shortly after. In all animals, photoreceptor cells detect this light, and they tell the brain, which then stimulates the release of sex hormones. But how exactly this works on a chemical level, it'll differ depending on the type of animal that you're looking at. For example, mammals that reproduce seasonally have photoreceptors in the retinas of their eyes, and these send signals to the pineal gland in their brain. The mammal pineal gland secretes melatonin, which is almost like a chemical clock. The darker that it is outside, the more melatonin is produced. And the lighter it is, the more light that these photoreceptor cells in the eyes pick up, the less melatonin is produced. This means that the mammal's body has a rhythmic cycle, where melatonin is present in high quantities at night and in low quantities during the day. During the winter, when the nights are long and the days are short, the overall quantity of melatonin in the body is relatively high, because there's more of these periods where melatonin is produced and less of the periods where melatonin isn't produced or where it's decayed. In contrast, in the summer, when the nights are short and the days are long, the overall quantity of melatonin is low. During the spring, when the days are getting longer, the total amount of melatonin in the body will gradually decrease, and at some point, the hypothalamus is made aware of this decreasing melatonin in the body. It's like this decreasing melatonin reaches like a warning level, and when that point is reached, the hypothalamus gets alerted, and then it goes on to stimulate the gonads to produce sex hormones. Now, besides mammals, you have diurnal reptiles, and they don't have these particular photoreceptors in their retinas. Instead, many reptiles have a so-called third eye, or a pineal eye. From the outside, it appears as little more than a thin layer of skin that has a small hole in it. But under that skin is a layer of photoreceptive cells. These detect daylight, and then they send signals to the pituitary gland. In birds, which are the evolutionary descendant of reptiles, the photoreceptors aren't in the retinas or in any kind of pineal organ. Instead, the bird's photoreceptors seem to be scattered throughout the brain itself. How these detect daylight, I have no idea. Another major group of hormones are those that are involved in the stress responses. These come from the adrenal glands, which are involved in the fight or flight responses that an animal engages in when it's under immediate threat. The adrenal glands release adrenaline, or epinephrine, which causes immediate body-wide changes to the animal. Heart rate and blood pressure increase, and the brain starts using way more oxygen as it's processing every detail of its environment that it can to get a full picture of what's going on, to maximize its chances of getting out of the situation and surviving. Furthermore, energy-rich molecules like lipids and sugars are dumped into the bloodstream to feed tissues like the skeletal muscle that the animal needs to run away, to dodge or avoid the threat, or to turn back and fight off its attacker. Another stress hormone is cortisol, which gets released during times of stress, but it gets released especially during times of prolonged stress. Adrenaline is a short-term rush to get the body moving out of an immediately dangerous position, but that doesn't mean that the animal isn't necessarily out of a stressful situation. Sometimes an animal can experience prolonged periods of stress, like if it's starving, or if it's traveling for some time through dangerous territory, or if it's being stalked by a predator or a pack of predators, or if it's under a heavy emotional load from the death of a parent, or a friend, or its entire herd, or whatever. Deaths in quick succession can take an extreme emotional toll, and we can really see this when we look at social animals, especially intelligent social animals like elephants, or gorillas, or humans. Now, the purpose of cortisol, the purpose of this long-term stress hormone, is to ensure that the brain has access to glucose. An animal that's under prolonged stress from, say, starvation, has to be vigilant for any opportunity to find food. An animal that's in dangerous territory or that's being stalked by predators will need to be constantly alert, on the lookout for where the predators are and any other threats, as well as ways to escape or to get out of the dangerous area or out of range of the predators. All of this extra cognitive effort causes the brain to consume a lot more energy, a lot more oxygen. So cortisol is there to convert various biomolecules into sugar, just for the brain. The problem is that this can be damaging to the rest of the body, especially if the animal is starving and it's not getting the nutrients it needs to rejuvenate itself. And this is because the cortisol will degrade the muscles to get amino acids that it can turn into sugar. Cortisol can also suppress the immune system and slows down the healing of wounds. Okay, so zooming out a bit, I want to look at how hormones affect the body as a whole. I mentioned earlier that hormones are involved in maintaining homeostasis. The body has a few set points, like temperature, pH, and water content, and if internal conditions move out of a safe range, homeostatic processes will kick in to get the body back into its safe range. Sensor cells can detect these changes, like increasing body temperature or decreasing pH. And effector cells are the cells that go about causing the physiological changes to return the body to homeostasis. Hormones are used to send information back and forth between the sensors and the effectors. There's a wide range of hormones that are involved in homeostasis. Leptin, for example, is a hormone produced and secreted by fat cells, by adipose tissue. When fat cells shrink, the amount of leptin that gets produced also shrinks. This stimulates the animal's appetite, and it discourages burning more energy. After eating, leptin levels rise again, and this helps inform the body that it's full, and the appetite is reduced. Another hormone is erythropoietin, or EPO, which gets released by various tissues, including those in the kidney. Erythropoietin encourages the formation of new red blood cells. More red blood cells means a higher oxygen carrying capacity in the blood. EPO is thus released to improve blood oxygen levels, which might be necessary to fuel muscle, especially in moments when the animal is using its muscles extensively, like it's running away or it's trying to chase after prey. When the animal is dehydrated, it will release antidiuretic hormone from its pituitary gland, which will then increase the permeability of the kidney's collecting duct, so as to extract more water back out of the urine. Conversely, the adrenal hormone aldosterone causes the distal tubules of the kidney to reabsorb sodium ions, which lowers the concentration of water and encourages more water to flow out of the kidneys into the bladder. So, antidiuretic hormone helps save water when the animal is dehydrated, and aldosterone helps get rid of excess water when the animal is overhydrated. Together, these two hormones play back and forth to manage the animal's internal water homeostasis. Remember how at the beginning of the episode I said that the endocrine system overlaps with the neural system? This overlap is no more evident than it is in the physical connection between the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, which forms a structure known as the hypothalamic pituitary axis. The hypothalamus has two distinct groups of neurons. One of them connects to the anterior pituitary, the front region of the gland, while the other group connects to the posterior pituitary, or the back region of the gland. The hypothalamic neurons secrete neurohormones into the pituitary gland. Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin are released into the posterior pituitary, where they're stored and then released. Antidiuretic hormone, as I said, affects kidney tubules, while oxytocin causes uterine contractions during labor and the release of milk during nursing. Oxytocin also plays a strong role in emotional pair bonding, like a mother has with her child. The hypothalamic nerves that reach into the anterior pituitary release a much wider range of hormones, including growth hormone and prolactin. Growth hormone works on a wide variety of tissues to promote growth and cell division. Prolactin works on the mammary glands to promote growth and milk production. Other hormones that are released through the anterior pituitary gland include thyroid-stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid to produce its own hormones. There's also adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal gland to produce glucocorticoids. And there's the follicle-stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone that both stimulate the gonads to produce gametes and sex hormones. Now, also earlier in the episode, I mentioned that hormones are targeted. They only work on specific tissues, because only those particular tissues express the receptor for that particular hormone. This allows the effect of a hormone to be focused, instead of causing some unintended reactions in non-target tissues. When a specific cell receptor binds to the specific hormone, this can then induce changes in the target cell that eventually produce the desired response. The last thing that I want to talk about today is how the cells respond after receiving their hormone signal. Consider a steroid hormone, which is lipid-soluble, and thus can slip through the plasma membrane into the target cell. Here, the steroid will bind to a hormone receptor, which forms a hormone receptor complex. This steroid protein complex enters the nucleus, and it physically binds to the DNA itself at a point called a hormone response element, and then it induces transcription. This doesn't just produce one mRNA transcript, it produces many copies of the mRNA, and all of these can be translated multiple times to produce the desired proteins. In this way, the effect of the hormone is magnified, as a single hormone molecule can initiate the production of dozens, or hundreds, or thousands of copies of the desired protein. Unlike steroids, you have amino acid derivatives and peptide hormones that bind to receptors that are present on the outer surface of the cell's plasma membrane. In cases like this, the receptor and the associated proteins in a protein complex are all far away from the nucleus. They're far away from the DNA because they're on the surface of the cell. It's metaphorically like the difference between the center of the Earth and the outer crust of the Earth, if the Earth is the cell. When it's bound to a hormone ligand, these receptor complexes can engage in signal transduction by starting enzymatic reactions that generate various byproducts, and these go on to have reactions of their own, and so on and so forth in an enzymatic cascade. The hormone signaling coordinates this enzymatic behavior and makes sure that the cells in a tissue are engaging in the right chemical pathways at the right time. The end result of these chemical pathways is the production of huge amounts of byproduct. For example, a single molecule of epinephrine binding to a liver cell can cause a signal transduction cascade that produces millions of glucose molecules. Now, what's really interesting is that there are often different types of receptors for the same hormone. Epinephrine, for example, can be bound by 4 unique types of receptors, each of them found on different types of tissue. This means that epinephrine can be released from one source, but only affect the 4 types of tissues that have a receptor for it. And because each tissue has its own unique type of receptor, the resulting cellular processes from binding to epinephrine and what that response is depends on each type of tissue. You can see how this can ultimately create a very fine-grained, highly regulated, high-resolution chemical environment, where released chemical signals can only react with the tissue that they're intended for, and they can only create specific desired responses based on the current state of the superstructure of the animal's body. That is the fundamental purpose of the endocrine system, to establish a communication grid within the animal's body, which then enables sensory cells to speak to all of the other organs and tissues and coordinate cellular growth and reproduction, to coordinate skeletal growth and sexual maturation, and the management of nutrients and chemical resources so as to sustain homeostasis. Chemical signaling in animals is what allows animals to stay alive and do all of the other things that animals do. Alright, this was a really fun episode, because I feel like the endocrine system, when you're talking about the animal organism and you're talking about all of its different body systems, I feel like the endocrine system is it's so poorly understood, and it's generally underemphasized. Although maybe, this is just my opinion. Maybe in your experience it's a little bit different. Maybe you had a professor who thought the endocrine system was super cool and spent a ton of time on it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you learned a fair amount about hormones and chemical signaling. Join me next week for my last episode in this second series on animal physiology, which will explore the 2 major divisions in the animal lineage, protostomes and deuterostomes. If you want to see what that's all about, then subscribe to my channel and enjoy these weekly episodes and all my other content. And as always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.